here and also this media factory. For those of you who don't know me, I'd like to welcome our guests from Lahti, from Helsinki Sanomat, from other places too. You're sitting in the media factory. For those of you who don't know what that is, it's part of Aalto University. It's one of the projects in Aalto which is trying to help people work across the boundaries of departments and schools. So we do sort of multidisciplinary stuff under the banner of media, and we also do some funding for projects, students and research projects. And on our website you'll find all the information about the stuff we do here and the facilities that we've got. The thing that we're working on very hard at the moment is behind the wall here is the Aalto Fab Lab, which is our new 3D digital fabrication facility, which is going to be a lot of fun when we finally get it up and running. But, today we have a very special guest, not a stranger to Finland or to this university. Martin Parr was professor here. What years, Martin?
1992.
Okay, 1992. So quite a while ago now. And I think Martin was a very central character in developing the photographic studies here and in bringing in a very sort of international element, which of course has been continued after he left. But at that time, I think photography in the photography department was a very different place, and the world was a very different place. And I guess Martin's also had to become digital, had to give up his plough bell at some point. But it's a great honour to have you here. We're really pleased. Martin's going to talk for, I don't know,
3 minutes.
And then we can have a chance for question and answers. I've got a feeling the air is going to run out in here at some point. Sorry for that, but you'll have to put up with it. So if you start feeling dizzy, go and have a glass of water in the kitchen or something. But welcome, Martin.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Can we kill those lights, you think?
Yeah.
Well, thanks, Phil. It's very good to be back in this university after a sabbatical of 20 years. Sadly, they didn't pay me for that period. Dream on, right? Anyway, I've been a photographer now for over 40 years, and what I'm going to do this morning is to basically try and talk you through my career, show how my work has changed, how the world of photography has changed, and to bring you up to speed. And to kick this off, I'm going to talk through first this 2002 catalogue, which is when I did a retrospective show, which started in London. And then, of course, I'm going to show you the work that I've done since, because that was 10 years ago. But I go the right way back now to my youth. I was brought up near London, and my grandfather was a very keen amateur photographer, and it was he that got me interested in photography in the first place. I used to go and stay with him. We would go and take pictures, process films, make prints. So by about the age of 13 or 14, I decided that I wanted to be a photographer. This is a dedication he put in a book that he gave me, which is called Instructions to Young Photographers. I then went to study photography at Manchester Polytechnic, and it's a very different type of photographic education then to what you might get now in both England and indeed in Finland too. In those days, before when I went, the notion of teaching was to train people to become an assistant, and then after a few years of being an assistant, you could then become a photographer in your own right. There was no notion of the photographic independent movement. There was no idea of selling prints. It was completely out of the question. And for my diploma show, we didn't even get a degree of photography in those days. I built a living room, and in this living room, I presented the photographs that I'd taken that were based around other people's living rooms. So it's like an installation. And this installation was then shown at the Impressions Gallery of Photography, which is the second photography gallery that opened in Britain after the Photographers Gallery in London had opened in the year 1972. And this is the installation, and in this installation I was playing a continual playing tape of The Sound of Music, I had cheap rose perfume. I was trying to create this rather kitsch environment to show my photographs that dealt with how people arranged their living rooms in the late 1960s, early 70s. Here are a few of the photographs, and for this I went and bought cheap, nasty frames to put my photographs in. These came from Woolworths, and this is a series called No Vacancies. It's a black and white photograph, hand-coloured, and it deals with the bed and breakfast establishments in Britain. One of the things you'll see in people's living rooms are wedding photographs. So I decided I would photograph Princess Anne getting married on the television, and then show the photographs that I'd taken in someone else's living room in my living room. Because I'm fascinated by the different ways in which photography enters into our society as objects and things of curiosity, one of the things I like to see are plates with photographs. You may have seen with people like John F. Kennedy or the Pope. I did a series called Bopper Plates, and these are young girls who would be the fans of the Bay City Rollers, and they'd be about 12, 13. And again, I photographed these in black and white, and then hand-coloured them and stuck them on an inappropriate plate. Now, I'm an obsessive photographer. I think any photographer, or indeed anyone in any art form gets anywhere, they have to be obsessed. And I get my obsessive genes from my father, who was an obsessive bird watcher. And when I was at college, I used to go on his bird watching trips. He was the president of the Surrey Bird Club, and take photographs of his fellow bird watchers. I call this one Passing Naturalist. This is a small town called Hebden Bridge. Hebden Bridge lies between Manchester and Bradford, and in the year 1975 I decided to move here with some other colleagues from the from the college, other art students, and we set up a workshop together called the Albert Street Workshop. And in this front room we had a gallery, and I had a wall where I was able to put up the local photographs that I'd taken and change them as I would replace them with new photographs. I spent 5 years living here, and in this time I documented the town, of course in black and white. Because you have to remember, back in the 1970s, if you were a serious photographer, you were obliged to work in black and white. Colour was the domain of advertising photography and snapshot photography. And the photographs that I took were really like a celebration of working class life and culture in this small town. The pictures are very nostalgic, everything's neat, everything in its place. And perhaps the one thing, or the one subject that encapsulated this tradition more than anything else, were the non-conformist chapels. These are small chapels with Methodists and Baptists, and I photographed these very thoroughly in this 5-year period that I was here. This is Crimsworth Dean Methodist Chapel, and I went up there and I got to know the small congregation of farmers, about 10 of them. I got to know them very well. I went to their houses and documented them and produced this very, as I say, celebratory folio about working class culture and rural life. After a few years of doing this, I wanted to change tone and decided to come up with a project called Bad Weather. Now in Britain, we don't get as extreme weather as you do here, and we talk about it all the time. It's a national obsession. So I like the idea of picking up on this national obsession, and also I like the idea that photography is meant to be done when the weather is good. If you go out with a camera and it's a sunny day, people literally say to you, what a good day for photography. So I like the idea of subverting that as well, and those two things made me think about photographing in and around bad weather. This is from the 1977 Silver Jubilee celebrations of the Queen. This is a washed out street party. I then went and bought an underwater camera, a Nikonos, and an underwater flash gun, and this enabled me to photograph, regardless of the problems getting water in the camera, in any circumstances. So this gave me total freedom. When they sold me the camera, they said I was the only photographer, non-swimmer, that had ever bought an underwater camera. This combination of flash and low light was something I got quite intrigued by. And you got these blobs and marks, and I started to explore these and incorporate them into my work. I then started one of the long processes of questioning many of the subject matters which photographers take up. And photographers, as we know, love to photograph things that are very extreme, very exotic, very beautiful. And I wanted to challenge this, and I came up with this idea during this project to try and photograph things that are very boring and very mundane. So when the weather was bad, I go out to places like motorway service stations, supermarket car parks, just for the hell of it, to challenge myself to see is it possible to take an interesting photograph in a very boring place. I also began to realize how subjective photography can be. If we look at this picture here, taken at night on a tripod of a park bandstand in Halifax, and a few moments later taken with flash. Two entirely different photographs. So which one is telling the truth? We understand, of course, there are different interpretations of the same scene. So if you acknowledge the photographer has within their grasp the ability to change the way things look, this inherent subjectivity was something I wanted to use a lot more in my photography. And this came out as a book in 1982, and since then I've become completely obsessed by books. Not only producing them myself, I've done over 50 and I've edited another 25, but I've also built up a very big collection of photography books. By the way, here's just some of my covers, just to give you an example. And in the year 2004-2006, together with my colleague Jerry Badger, we did a history of the photo book, volumes 1 and 2. We're now working on volume 3. And last year, for example, I worked on a book on Latin American photography books, and now I'm working on a book about the history of Chinese books. And the reason why I feel very strongly about this is because, as a photographer, I know that the main source of inspiration I get from work is seeing it in book form. And if you talk to other photographers, they will also share this passion with me. And yet the history of photography has really not dealt with the photographic book. So one of the things I wanted to do is give the book a new status. And all these documents and this exploration of the book, almost, if you like, become revisionist histories. So one of the things we can do in this process is to question the history of photography, because by nature, it's very subjective. And at the moment, it's been owned by the theorists and academics in Europe and America. So part of this task is to bring it back and make it more owned by photographers, because we understand the things that inspire us and how ideas are passed on from one generation to the next and from one country to the next. And as well as being an editor, I'm also a curator. I do this because I've been very lucky and fortunate. I've been given a platform to share the people whose work I'm enthusiastic with other people. And this is often done through exhibitions, and particularly with festivals. Arles, as you may know, is the biggest photo festival in the world. And in the year 2004, I was invited to be the artistic director of this. And this gave me a chance to present 25 new shows. And last year, 2 years ago now, in 2010, I curated the Brighton Photo Biennale, which is the biggest photo festival in Britain. I'm also running a series of books for Nazreli Press. They're an American publisher. I'm doing 10 books for them. They're called Parr Nazreli. I hope your library's got them all. There's 6 published so far. This is one done by a brilliant Dutch photographer called Jan Banning called Bureaucratics. And he went around 8 different countries and photographed the bureaucrats you would find in those countries. If you go to Bolivia and you have a problem, this is the man you have to come and see. I also collect political ephemera, and I hated Mrs. Thatcher. In fact, she was toppled when I was here in Helsinki. I remember the moment very clearly. And I couldn't believe that anyone would go out and buy a plate or a mug with her image on. And rather perversely, this is a thing that inspired me to go out and collect Thatcher memorabilia. And since then, I've started collecting not only books, but all this ephemera, because I think of collecting and photographing as being very similar activities. If you're a photographer, one of the things you're fundamentally doing is collecting images of the world and trying to make sense of it through photography, and that very much overlaps with the whole notion of collecting objects and books and postcards and such like. I collect trays with photographs on. I love this idea of the humble tray with its cup of coffee or glass of wine on, having a photograph on. This photograph is so bad that it becomes good. And this is another territory that I like to explore, when bad and good taste become one. That's the kind of photograph they made us take when we were at college, still life photograph. Here's the Hotel Moscow in Moscow. I got this around the time of its demolition. Here are the trays all together. This is a catalogue I did in 2004 because I've built up a substantial collection of watches with photographs of Saddam Hussein on the front. And this is a catalogue for that. Here's just a few to give you an example. This is a nice fake Rolex. Here's an early Saddam, and much later. So within a week of his capture, these are available on eBay. That's them all together. And now we're coming a little bit more up to date. This is Obama ephemera. When he was inaugurated, there are something like 20,000 objects on eBay. I didn't go through literally every one of them, but I tried to find examples of ephemera which I thought were a bit different. These are some underpants I got from Hong Kong, flip-flops. A box of cereal, hope in every bowl. And now the latest collection, or one of the latest collections I'm doing, is Osama bin Laden is Dead. This is a bin Laden is Dead skateboard. This is an orange soda drink. And this is a guitar to defeat terrorism. I have a 9/11 collection as well, but this is just one I thought I'd show you. I've just got this recently, I'm very happy with it. And the latest collection on the watch front is Gaddafi watches. Rather less made than Saddam. This is the 39, by the way, is the 39th year of his dictatorship. They go up to 41, but I haven't been able to get a 41. So if anyone's got a 41 Gaddafi watch, see me afterwards, we'll work out a deal. I'll swap a print for a Gaddafi watch with 41 on the front. I just want to show you a few of my influences as a photographer. I think it's very important to recognize that we take on all kinds of ideas as well as photography, and these become part of who we are. And one of the things that Britain still does well, and there aren't many things, is we're good at irony, okay, and we have a good sense of humor. And there's nothing better than, say, Tony Hancock, who is the old-time brilliant British comedian. Very few of you would have heard of him. And the same kind of vulnerability that he shows so brilliantly is often the same vulnerability I'm trying to show in my own work. This is a Tony Ray Jones photograph. He was a very good photographer who died very young, but he had done in the late 60s a wonderful body of work, which is published as a book called A Day Off. And this is very influential to me when I was at college. This is taken at Margate. And this is my old friend Chris Killip. I remember seeing this issue of Creative Camera magazine when the new pictures he'd done in the northeast of England were published first. And it's one of those moments where a shiver goes down your spine. And I think you have to relish these rare moments of true inspiration that we find and incorporate them into your own work and take the goodness from them, suck the goodness out, so to speak. I love the humble postcard. This has been a great source of inspiration for me too. This is the M1, the first motorway in Britain, opened in 1959. And strangely enough, I was taken onto the motorway in the 60s when I was a teenager as a treat. You can imagine going onto the motorway now as a treat. This is a Roger Minnick photograph, which I wish I'd taken in the 1970s. And what's interesting about this, in the late 70s, we began to see colour photography being taken seriously, particularly in America. So we had the famous Eggleston show at New York, MoMA, Stephen Shaw, Roger Minnick, Joel Meritz, all these people started to emerge and do museum shows. These have all these names have become quite famous, with the exception of Roger Minnick, in fact. And this is very exciting to this young black and white British photographer in the late 70s to see this. When I was at university, I keep saying that, but it's college, I used to go to work at Butlins Holiday Camp. Butlins Holiday Camp is this strange British institution where people roll up. It's very bright and colourful, almost kitsch. And I worked there as a photographer, but I was very taken with the postcards that were produced around this holiday camp and started to collect these. And I think really it's the combination of these brightly coloured postcards and the work from America that made me change to colour in the year 1982, when I started this project called The Last Resort, which is about a run-down seaside resort near to Liverpool in the north of England called New Brighton. Now the idea here was to show the very shabby and run-down backdrop, but in front of it there was the domestic activity of people having a day out with the kids, etc. So if you like, the point of these pictures is this sort of ambiguity between the domestic activity and the shabby backdrop. Now, the baby there, it turns out to be a guy called Paul, and about 5 years ago he emailed me and said, I'm a student at St. Martin's in London, I'm studying graphic design, I'm doing a project about your project. So we got talking and he told me who his mother was, I sent her a print, and it's very nice to get an email from a baby. Look at this litter. Of course, remember, my job as a photographer is to create fiction out of reality. So in order to achieve that, I have to heighten and exaggerate reality, not through Photoshop, but just by choosing the moment. So for something like New Brighton, I'd make sure that I go when the weekend was at its busiest, when there's lots of people there, there's therefore lots of litter, because I wanted to show litter just floating around, being all over the place. And look at this beach. Funnily enough, you probably couldn't take this now, you'd be arrested, because even the difference in the 25 years ago since I did these pictures in like dealing with children and such like has changed quite dramatically. This came out as a book in '86, and many of these early books were self-published for no better reason for the fact that I couldn't find a publisher. So I was able to get a small grant from the Arts Council and do the distribution and got the book out. The next project I did in the 80s was something about the whole idea of the consumer society, which had really started to develop in the 80s under Mrs. Thatcher. And it struck me that looking around as a documentary photographer, there are certain things that photographers like to photograph and certain things that they don't. And one of the things that was entirely missed out was the whole notion of shops and shopping and supermarkets. So I took it upon myself to take my camera and go into supermarkets and photograph. This is M&S. I like the detail of broccoli in the middle here, because broccoli was having a great decade in the 80s. Everybody was suddenly eating it. So the broccoli revival is documented thus. Frozen food centre. Tesco's. And something as simple as filling up with petrol can be interesting. I don't know if you know, but down in the Super Lab, what's it called, that place, Philip? Where the show is, the Think of Finland?
Laboratory.
The laboratory, which is where? In the centre of Helsinki?
Yeah, in Erottaja.
Okay, so there, last night we had the opening of my Think of Finland exhibition, which is something I did in association with Viewmasters, who are an agency here in Helsinki, and with Nokia, where last year I came and photographed in Finland. And one of the pictures I really like is a Finnish guy filling up his car with petrol. So it's obviously a bit of a theme I've had over the years. Tupperware party. I wanted to photograph home selling as well. And here's a Tupperware party in full swing. After the 80s, or in the late 80s, I started to travel a lot more internationally, and this gave me a chance to photograph supermarkets not only in Britain but also abroad. So this one, for example, is in Ireland. We are in Spain, and even St. Petersburg in Russia. And the final project I did in the 80s was something about the middle classes. Now, in Britain we have a much more defined class system than perhaps you do in Finland. And I am so middle class, it's quite outrageous. And it struck me again that in the representation of photography and its connection to what's going on in the world or in the UK, the middle classes were the one class that weren't really photographed. People tended to show working class life and the wealthy, and I decided therefore to do a portrait of my own class over the next 5 years. By this time I'd moved from Liverpool down to Bristol in the soft south of England. This is the Royal Commonwealth Society, function for a summer evening. I also decided I should photograph people that I knew had voted for Mrs. Thatcher, and I went to the social events connected with the Conservative Party, and I chose in particular the events where people were doing things in domestic houses, i.e. in people's houses. This, for example, is a Bath Young Conservatives Midsummer Madness Party. And if this is the Young Conservatives, I hate to think what the ordinary ones are like. You can't photograph everything, so one of the things I like to start with is thinking about the things I like and dislike, i.e. my prejudices, and photographing in and around them. I don't like crafts at all, so I went to lots of craft fairs. Here's the reluctant wallet about to come out again. And it's just at the time my partner was pregnant, so she said we have to go to National Childbirth Trust antenatal classes. I'm sure there's the equivalent in Finland, breathing exercises and all that for couples. I said I'd happily go if I could take my camera. The dinner party. Aerobics. And this came as a book in '89. Now it's around this time that I started getting interested in the whole idea of doing more work for magazines. It seemed like a natural follow-on for me. In those days, of course, over 25 years ago, the budgets for magazines and documentary photography were a lot bigger, and I thought I should try and join an agency. So I looked round and decided that the most interesting and the most difficult one to try and join would be Magnum Photos. So I started the very long process of trying to become a member of Magnum, which I eventually did in 1994. But in something like '89, I started my first level of membership and nominee, and I was then able to get jobs and assignments which helped me, particularly on my own work. I just started a project about tourism, and I got assigned to do things like this is the Gambia in Africa for the Telegraph magazine in the UK. This, for example, is India for a German magazine. And then my editorial career started to take off, which is very exciting. This is for the Whites of Zimbabwe for the Sunday Times. I still do now some editorial work, but less than before, because that marketplace has somewhat declined. But I often would go somewhere. I went to the Abu Dhabi Arms Fair in the Middle East, and would then be able to sell the pictures afterwards. I wouldn't particularly be assigned, I would just go and then get Magnum to help me to sell them. Strangely, as I'm about the least fashionable person you could come across, people started to ask me to do fashion photography about 15 years ago. And about 5 years ago, a gallery in Paris asked me to do a show of my fashion work. And to accompany that, I did a catalogue, because fashion is always seen in magazines, if you like. So we decided to make a magazine rather than a book. In this magazine, I showed all the old spreads that I'd done for different magazines, like this one. This is for Italian Amica. This is something done in Essex. We literally went to Essex with a van full of clothes and accessories and found people on the street. I often like the idea of using real people for fashion shoots. And in this magazine, we tried this concept whereby I would take all the photographs, not only the editorial, but also the advertising, the social pages like this, the travel and the food pages too. And in order to pay for this, we made ads, or we offered to make ads for different brands. This, for example, is for Paul Smith, who I've done a lot of work with, and his company gave us a bag. I then went out and photographed it, and this then became an ad for Paul Smith, and we got 20 of these, which paid for the magazine. When the show went to Japan, I did another project with Paul Smith, and I just photographed for him rather than for different brands. But we still had, 70% editorial. And this is something I did in 2008, and this is the biggest editorial assignment I've ever done for anyone. This is for The Guardian newspaper in the UK, the left-leaning newspaper, very good one. And they invited me to do 10 city supplements, 16 pages, and these supplements were then added to the paper in that particular city. And therefore it was 160 pages of editorial, which is a big assignment. To show you a few, I did a lot of portraits because if you're only shooting, if you've got 5 days to shoot a city, it's best to use a lot of portraiture. Belfast. In the center of every newspaper, we did a double-page spread. The Guardian, to this day, has a center spread photograph every day in the middle. It's one of the things they started. A lot of other newspapers have copied this as an idea. This is in Newcastle, northeast of England. Occasionally I do advertising. It's a great form of prostitution, but it does give you money and freedom to do other things. Here now are some of the pictures from the tourism project called Small World. This first came out as a book in 1995. I think about 4 years ago I did an updated version, and in fact I'm doing another version this year. This is Pisa, of course, in the Alps. The great thing about tourism is we have in our mind what a place looks like. It's like a mythology of a place. And when you get there, the reality is quite different. So the good thing with photography, you can often show that contradiction, mythology versus reality, in the same photograph. This is Venice. This is Venice in Las Vegas, so it's not a real Venice, a complete fabricated one. This is also Las Vegas. You can see, this is Paris, Las Vegas. You can see the world in one city. This is China. Because of my project about Chinese photography books, I go to China quite a lot, so I always do some shooting. This is Japan. This is the biggest indoor beach in the world. It's called Ocean Dome. Just down the road is the real beach, but no one's there. They're all inside, huddled together in their 32 degrees. No, 28 degrees I think it is. They keep it at a bit hot, but not too hot. Here's the second edition. Now around 1995, I decided to change camera and tone and pace, and I bought a macro lens with a ring flash. This is the combination usually associated with medical photography. You can get very close, and I wanted to explore coming up close and seeing what I could do with this. And the first project I decided to do is the one as full of prejudice as possible, which is about British food, because British food, of course, has a terrible reputation, and yet it's had a bit of a renaissance in the last few decades. So I still went out and found the worst examples of British food that I could, to please people from Finland, for example. And I then went out and looked for cliches in Europe. I mean, cliches are all there, and you were all told at college and by people, avoid cliches. I love cliches, and I often make them my starting point. If you see the Finnish show that I've done, you'll see that very often I've made Finnish cliches my starting point for that. So here, I went to 8 different countries and looked for the cliches associated with those countries. This is Britain. French snails, Germany, Holland. And all these pictures came together into a book which was published in the spring of 1999. And for this exhibition, I made a set of A3 laser copies, and we then were able to send this to 45 different galleries in 5 continents. So we had 45 shows running simultaneously in the spring of '99. That's where that previous picture was in London. This is in Montreal, just to give you an example of the different ways in which people would hang this exhibition. Here are some pictures now from this project. This is taken in Benidorm. This is back to food as social landscape. This is one of those breakfasts in Las Vegas, $5.99, help yourself. That's also in America. I couldn't have done this project without going to the States. Can you read the watch? It says, "I love bingo." This is the ashtray at Disneyland in Las Vegas. No, in Los Angeles, sorry. And Tokyo, Disneyland. Key West. Out of all the books that I've ever published, this one I technically edited, but strangely enough, this has been the book that's sold the most, and it hasn't got one single one of my pictures in, and it's been reprinted, I don't know, a dozen times or something. And this revived my interest in things boring, which remember I spoke about that earlier when I was doing the Bad Weather project. And I'd remembered that I'd seen a signpost to a town called Boring over in Oregon. And I decided therefore to make a pilgrimage to the town of Boring, I think in the year 2001 or 2, something like this, to try and photograph everything in the town of Boring. So I spent 5 days there, going literally around and photographing every house, every street, every traffic light. Here's another one. And then I put these together into an album which had 468 slots for end prints, and of course I called it Boring Photographs. This was then produced as an edition of 10, which was sold to my galleries as a sort of hybrid between a print and a book. An artist's book, for want of a better word or phrase. And out of all the countries that I photographed, perhaps, of course, the one I photographed in most of all is the UK. And every decade or so, I try and do a new collection of images from Britain. This is the last one I did, which is called Think of England, which actually was the thing that inspired the Think of Finland project. And this is all done on the macro lens. So you can see this whole body of work, I often focus on something in the foreground, like the flags here, and let the whole thing drop off behind it. And of course that's got a kiss of flash on it, just to brighten it up, even though it's a very sunny, bright day. Back to the seaside, I'm always inspired by the seaside. This is Weymouth. And this is like a self-portrait. I'm a great believer in socks and sandals, which is in itself another cliche. This is Eastbourne. And apart from irony, the other thing we can still do very well in Britain is make a good cup of tea, which is something that doesn't happen in Finland, I have to say. And of course, the secret to a good cup of tea is a teapot. And if you're really being serious, you'll have a tea cozy. For those of you who don't know, this is like a coat for a teapot, and they're often knitted by old ladies, and they're very cheap and reasonable. I like the fact that we're a multicultural country. So I'm also able to sort of like do a little critique about England and at the same time, you know, celebrate the things that I like. So this tension, almost, you know, an ambiguity and a contradiction again I come back to, because for me it is a very central theme and idea behind my work. So going round and photographing Britain is almost like a form of therapy for me as well. Okay, so we're well past the retrospective now. I'm now going to show you a couple of projects that show the thinking that I've been putting into the book and how to make the narrative and the production values an essential ingredient to the book and the message of this book. So I'm going to start by showing you 2 or 3 of these, and this is one called Parking Spaces, which I think came out about 5 years ago. And this is meant to look very precious. It's meant to look like a wedding album, because I wanted to give the idea that inside this book is something that is very valuable and important. Because inside here, what I'm showing are from 43 different countries, the parking space, the last car parking space. Because whether you live in Finland, Melbourne or Barcelona, we all have the same problem. You can't find anywhere to park the car. So when you see a parking space, you should jump at it, even though I'm showing you places that have probably gone if you go back there now. These photographs are arranged alphabetically, so it's a very thorough project. And these two, for example, are America. Here we are in Russia. And of course, once I've got to that country, I want to ensure that you know where it is. So if you're in Russia, you look for a statue of Lenin. And there, sure enough, is a parking space underneath. What a bit of luck that is. In China, on the left is Lebanon, on the right is Slovenia. Or is it Lithuania? Yes, alphabetically. Amsterdam. And this is a book about Mexico. It's really a book about the cultural mix that you find in Mexico from America. Because when I first went to Mexico, I couldn't believe that all these Mexican men wear American-style baseball hats. So I started to photograph these and also look for other icons of culture from both Mexico and America that can be found in Mexico. So it's really a book about the relationship between America and the rest of the world. This is the Day of the Dead suites. The Day of the Dead is a big celebration which happens in November, where they celebrate and party in the graveyard by the side of their loved ones. And up against that now, of course, Halloween, which is the same idea, but the American export. This is the American cemetery in Mexico City. It's a very religious country. And the ubiquitous car. And of course the greatest icon of all, Coca-Cola. And here's another book. This is Playas. That's basically beaches in Spanish. And because I've been working on this book on Latin America, I've been and photographed on many of the major countries in Latin America, and I've been to their beaches, because you go there in the winter, the European winter, and it's the height of summer in Latin America. And because of my long-term fascination with beaches. Now, I wanted to make a book that had a sort of nice trashy feel to it. Something like associated with the junk novel from Latin America. So I got in touch with my publishing friend in Mexico City and asked him to help me arrange the production of this. So in Mexico City, there's an area where they do these very cheap wedding invitations. So he went down there with half a dozen pictures and met some of the designers, gave them all a set of JPEGs, and invited them to come up with some ideas. We looked at all these designs, and we then chose the worst one. Now, most photographers who have a book out, of course, they want really good printing, beautiful, unobtrusive graphics. Here we wanted really bad printing and appalling graphics, which is what we got. We then went and tried to find a printer, and again we tested about 3 or 4 printers, and we chose the worst printer as well, and we encouraged them to make as many mistakes as possible. Here, for example, is a sheet with no yellow pass, and virtually every one of these books is different because it's all got different mistakes in. But don't forget the original subject matter. This is Mar del Plata. This is the biggest resort in Argentina, and it's a bit like going to Coney Island from the 1960s. Acapulco. And just to finish off, here's a nice bit of double printing, but only on one side, so that's pretty rare. And here's a much more sophisticated book, i.e. it's better printed and better laid out, much more conservative. But about 5 years ago, I'd started this big project called Luxury, and what I wanted to do during the boom period of the early years of the last decade, where the whole world was going mad, I wanted to go out and photograph these wealthy people enjoying themselves. And the best way I thought to get access to wealthy people would be to go to the social events that they all come to. So I went to fashion parties, I went to horse racing, I went to art fairs and photographed them at these events. Here's the art fair in Dubai. This is in London, this is Frieze Art Fair. Now we're on to the races. This is Ascot. And I went a lot to the BRIC countries and to the Middle East. This is in Dubai again. I love Dubai. This is the races at Dubai. This is South Africa. I thought it has to be interesting to see what's happening in South Africa. So I went to the biggest race meeting in South Africa. It's in Durban. It's called the Durban July. And there you have the old whites still coming out, but you now have this new generation of wealthy blacks who are now being served by the whites. Old money in France. And this is Melbourne. This is the Melbourne Cup in Australia. This is Russia. This is the Gucci store in Moscow. This earns more money per square meter than any other Gucci store in the world. And here we are at the Millionaires Fair in Moscow. This is an event where you can only buy very expensive things. You can buy a wine cellar, a helicopter, a diamond-encrusted mobile phone. Anyway, as you all know, come the year 2008, the whole world went wonky, and I thought, oh dear, I've missed my boat here because I hadn't got my book out, and yet this whole thing had changed. But now I think of it as an epitaph to that sort of crazy bubble period. It's not as if wealthy people have disappeared, they're just a little bit less showy about showing this off to the world. This is also at the Millionaires Fair in Moscow. This is the launch of Donald Trump vodka. Beijing car show. Okay, so that last sort of 10-year period where I really looked at the whole internationalization, globalization, these issues. Now I'm much more interested in doing local things. I'm working in the Black Country. The Black Country is an area near to Birmingham in the Midlands of Britain, which is quite run down. And I'm doing now a 4-year project about documenting this weekend. I'll be back to the Black Country, for example. And I just thought I'd show you a few pictures from here. This is from the first year. So every year I do a show of the work that I've done in a particular area, and at the end of it there will be a very big show in a book with the whole project in. And this is the new way in which I like to hang pictures, and the pictures are hung like this down in the show in Helsinki, and it's using the magnet system because no one's got budget now for framing, and the whole thing, you frame it up, it's very expensive, and then what do you do with these frames afterwards? So what we do now is I tend to print these up or send files and have them printed in that country, put them up with this magnet system, and at the end of the show we just tear up the prints. And when I did the Brighton Photo Biennale in 2010, I made the whole festival frame free. It's the first time a photography festival had ever been done where frames were banned. In the Fringe, which is meant to be the alternative young up-and-coming thing, they had old-fashioned frames. But in our main show, we show new photographers, so it's a whole generation, because the trouble with mid-generation photographers, some of which I'm sure are sat in this room, is they all say, oh no, you've got to print with my printer, I can't give you prints. The great thing about showing you emerging photographers, they're just so happy to get the slot, because all of them had a show for the first time outside of their own country. They would send us the files, they'd send us a test print, we made prints and put them up, and that kept the budget right down in order that we could concentrate on things like finding the airfare for them to come to the festival. So this whole way of working is what's going to happen in the future. I predict it now, and it does make a lot of sense. Here are just a few of the pictures. This is a sweet factory. I also do films, and if you go to my site, you can look at clips of this, for example. This is a sweet factory in Dudley. Dancing. Portraits, of course. And the Black Country is one area in the country where we actually celebrate St. George's Day, which is the national day of England. It's no bank holiday, most people don't even notice it, they don't even know it's on. And this is the one place where they go bonkers. And one of the things I like to do now is to create archives. So if you go out and shoot a project for a week or 2 weeks or whatever, you take a lot of pictures, most of which are bad pictures, right? You need to take a lot of bad work in order to know the good. But often these bad, uninteresting pictures have a lot of very valuable information on them. And what we did for this particular show is we showed all the bad pictures as a grid as an archive. So it's 680 pictures. Many of them are not very good, but the information in them is good. There's people, there's places, there's different things. And then upstairs, of course, we'd selected what we thought were the best 25. And we actually then made an archive box, which I'll show you in the next slide, of these pictures. Of course, because we're doing portraits, we invite all the people along to the opening, and then we create this sort of archive box. Okay, this is the last thing I'm going to show you today, and it's a series of photographs called Auto Portrait. And this is, I've been doing now for about 20 years, and it's really a celebration, if you like, of the different ways in which you can have your portrait taken around the world. And I've gone in, this all started because I started to travel, and I'd see a portrait studio and I'd go in and say, God, I'd love to buy that picture there of this couple or this family, but of course you can't because it's someone else's photo. So I thought the best way around this would be to go in and volunteer to have my own photograph taken, which I could then take away. So two things have happened in this 20-year period of some significance. I've got a lot older, and you can see here, young, virile, handsome, with grey hair. Now I'm clapped out and virtually a pensioner. And the other thing that's happened is that photography's changed from analog to digital all over the world. There's virtually no analog portraits being done. So it's an amazing change that we've witnessed in the last 20 years in digital and photographic technology. So I record this shift through the portrait, if you like. This is in Jamaica. Here we are in Spain. And here's a classic analog picture taken in Havana, in Studio Hanoi. And of course, it's a black and white photograph that's been hand colored. Perhaps the only place in the world now where you can get an analog portrait is North Korea. This is taken in Pyongyang. And this is a technique which has also sadly died. This is from the northeast of Brazil. And this is where they literally take a black and white portrait and they hand color it with oil paints. And likewise, this is something else which we know has disappeared, because the last guy, we found the last guy in Mexico who was actually making these hand-carved portraits, which is all the boom and rage in the 1960s. And they would take a photo and then hand-carve the portrait around you. Here's another one. So we had 25 of these commissioned by this guy. And now it's the analog, it's the digital age, sorry, and you can be with anyone, anywhere you like, at any time. One of the things I did, of course, here was keep the very same serious expression. All photographers want you to smile. I have to resist the smile in order to keep some compatibility with the other photographs. This is me in Atlanta last year. Oh, 2 years ago, good God. And you can see now the only thing that's holding anyone back is the imagination of these photographers. This is also done in Dubai. If you think this is weird, have a look at this. This is in America. China. Singapore. This studio supplied the clothes, in fact, and this is the only jacket that I could actually get into. This is from China. They have these fantastic wedding studios in China where the bride and groom go along a couple of weeks before the wedding and have a whole album created, and they do 4 or 5 different sets of clothes. So I went along on my own, sadly, and had my album created. Here's some very creative jacket flipping and dropping. And this is a picture that I want to leave you with. It's taken in New York. Thank you very much. So I want to be very interested to field any questions, either difficult or easy.
Are the people always knowing that you're photographing them? Because you seem to be really close.
Sometimes they know, and sometimes they don't. I mean, where it's appropriate, I'll have sought permission. You know, if you're going to, say, a private party, then you know, you've got permission from the owner. And then the rest of the time, you're sort of dealing with things on a case-by-case situation. You know, there's about 1 person in 50 who has a you know, very hostile reaction to being photographed, and you soon get to know who those people are. They make it very clear, and you pick them up on your radar. You know, I appear very casual when I'm photographing, but I'm watching everybody to wait for these 1 in 50, which inevitably come up. And the rest of the time, I just deal with it when it's, you know, where appropriate. If I need to explain, I'll explain. If not, I won't.
Do you ever get punched in the nose?
No, touch wood. Is it wood or yeah, it is wood actually. Touch wood. I've never been hit. I mean, I expect fully one day to have that happen. It's an occupational hazard, but so far I've avoided it. And, you know, I've had a few run-ins and such like, but it's never come to physical violence.
Has there been a change in people's attitudes towards having their picture taken?
I mean, you could argue that it's more difficult now to take pictures on the street than it was, say, 25 years ago, because people are a lot more savvy about what happens to photographs. But at the same time, everyone's got a camera now, all the time. So it's no great novelty seeing someone with a camera. Obviously, if you've got a more sophisticated camera, people might notice that a bit more. But, you know, it swings and roundabouts, really. In some cases, it's better. I mean, there are certain countries where you can't photograph easily, like France. Well, you can photograph, but you can't use them because you're likely to be sued. So when I do photograph in France, I have to have a couple of people running around getting releases from the main people in the photographs, which is a nuisance, but it has to be done. So France, despite its incredible contribution to photography, is the most difficult country in the West, in the first world, to photograph. And then in the third world, the most difficult places are the French colonies, because they're even worse. They want money if you just pick up a camera, let alone anything else. But, you know, generally, like Finland's a doddle to photograph in. You're very lucky. Very nice people, the Finns.
Martin, you talk about weed. What sort of business do you have around you?
Well, I live in Bristol, but I have an office in London where I have 2.5 people working full time, and they are doing all the scanning, all the printing, all the archiving, and this gives me a chance to go out and take pictures. So I don't do any technical backup whatsoever. The only thing I'll do is edit, usually on a big computer, occasionally I just download onto a small Epson or something. So this gives me the freedom to go out and shoot more. And then of course I have Magnum, I'm in Magnum still. And we have 4 offices, so they're doing a lot of the organization of the more commercial projects that I'm doing. And then I have, like over 10, 11 dealers who my office are supplying with prints and producing shows when they're required.
You obviously had a huge amount of work on film before digital cameras came, so how have you gone about
we basically scanned, I've got 25,000 high res on the Magnum site for instant download. So we have a constant scanning program. We have a Flexitite, and it's basically used 2 or 3 days a week solidly to catch up with my archive. So we are really cracking on now, and have virtually, scanned all the pictures that I want. I've yet to go through every contact, but that's something I'm going to do when I'm in a wheelchair.
You said that the way you work in Brighton, with that people would send just files and would print them without framing and then would throw the prints away in the future.
Yeah.
That you see that more happening in the future?
For sure, yeah.
How do you see then the future of young artists making income as a photographic artist instead of? Well,
that, as you know, because you're fully aware of the Helsinki School, which has done quite well for many of the ex-students from here. But that sort of taps into a different mentality where everything's framed and very precious because you're trying to make these, into prints that are sold into the marketplace. The shows where I would print out things like that tend to be the shows in public arenas, whereas you generally find the shows that I have in commercial galleries still want to frame, because if you just pin pictures on the wall in a gallery for a commercial purpose, it doesn't feel like as revered and as valuable as it would be if it's framed up. So generally, for most of the commercial shows I do, they're framed still. But the ones, they're less exciting, although they may generate income, than the shows I would do, like the one here, which isn't a commercial show whatsoever. You could buy a print from it, but I don't expect to sell a print, because it's the idea of presenting the work. So I think there are two things which are quite distinctively different. So if you aspire to be a gallery artist, which I assume you do, just looking at you I can tell, then of course you have to frame up and you have to be very rigorous about the printing and all that stuff, right?
Yes.
But I'm much more in favour of provoking with photography rather than selling it.
Where you can combine the both.
You can. I'm lucky. I have one foot in both camps. But generally speaking, if you start out, you've got to, you generally need to sort of go towards one tendency or the other.
What do you feel your contribution is to photography?
It's not something that I think about particularly. It's not for me to say. Because one of the other thing, the third and fourth and final thing we do well in Britain is understatement. Yeah, if you want to brag, get an American photographer to do a talk. So I don't think about it. I just do these things. I have all the things I've tried to explain today about, like the books and things like that, curating, and my own work. But I'm just thinking about the next project rather than the bigger picture.
I'm thinking maybe more in the sense that you have chosen a slightly different subjects than, photography has been historically.
Sure, yeah, but any photographer that gets some kind of recognition usually does that. So that's no great shakes, because that's the thing that's going to distinguish them from other photographers. Because remember, most photographers out there are generic copies of what other people have done. When you're reviewing folios of students' work, you recognize the influences, you see where they've gone, but they haven't yet, this is often the case, found their own voice. The most difficult thing for an emerging, i.e. student photographer to do is to find their own voice, to show how they're different from everything else, because subconsciously we just copy other people's ideas and work and make it our own versions of that, but you have to sort of force that whereby it becomes your voice rather than just a generic copy. And inevitably, most people don't go beyond that. Thank God, because that's what keeps it interesting, because you cannot exactly define how you achieve that. You cannot exactly define how and when you can take a good photograph. That's what makes it exciting, and that's what keeps someone like me being a photographer.
you don't feel that you found it.
Well, I feel I've got my voice, right? But I still can't tell you how to take a good photo. I can think of the circumstances that are going to help that to happen, right? Doing a lot of pictures, you're much likely to get a better picture than, because remember, I take more bad pictures than probably anyone else in this room because I'm a very prolific photographer, because I know it ain't easy and you've got to take a lot of rubbish to find anything half decent.
Do you have some topic, like social topic, you're interested in right now? I mean, you've been going from working class to luxury.
Well, I'm very promiscuous, and I'm interested in all these topics. So, yeah, I mean, what can I say? I'm interested in many things. I mean, my problem is just finding the right avenues to identify certain ideas and topics, or countries, places. There's so much I want to do. You can't do everything, so you have to. I mean, you respond to the offers that come, and then you respond also to the things you want to do.
Have you found difference on people's reactions during the years, or your work? I mean, like.
Well, strangely enough, because I always think it's strange, my work has always been quite controversial, because I think what I do is so blatantly obvious that it should be done, that I'm always surprised by this. So when I was joining Magnum, there was a huge fuss about my work. They said, I'm cynical, exploitative, and all these things. And because my work is often a critique rather than a celebration, that certainly got the bristles of the humanitarian photographers in Magnum, quite agitated. But I've realised, of course, quite early on that being controversial never does you any harm. So it's not something that I avoid or anything like that. But I don't even think about it. I just do what I think needs to be done. But it still does annoy people for some reason, and that, as I say, is not a bad thing.
I mean, has there also been difference because of the people, like you said, like camera is everywhere all the time, and people take so many kind of different pictures, and you can see more and more pictures everywhere.
Yes,
so,
yes.
So are they more like tolerate on the kind of pictures you take, or can they?
Who's they?
I don't know, like people in general, like the audience who see and try to figure out your pictures.
I don't know. It's not something I really think about. But for sure, there are more photos being taken. There's more people interested in photography now. You have Flickr and all these photo sharing sites with millions of members. But that's all good news for us photographers, because it gives you an audience. Because let's face it, the main people who come to photo shows are people interested in photography, and many of them are photographers. So I don't think this is an issue or a problem. I very much like the ongoing democracy found in photography, and we all benefit. So when people say, are you threatened by journalists and all these people with cameras, I say not at all. I welcome them all. Can't get enough. And that's more bad work around, right, in order to distinguish and understand the good. Like Blurb alone, there's over 1 million books published every year. You can imagine most of them are absolute crap, right? But we need to have that in order that when a good book comes out, we understand why it's good.
So you don't feel it's more more difficult to shock people?
No, because shock. Well, I remember no one, generally speaking, people who do shock don't go out to shock. There's a few that may cynically sort of exploit that, but certainly not. I don't even think about it myself. I don't regard my pictures as shocking whatsoever. And people who do, I think, are bonkers.
But you say that Ouija is your big influence.
Well, I don't know. You're the second person in Finland who's said that. I mean, of course, he's a photographer I like, but I wouldn't say he's a big influence. But he's someone I admire. But if I had to think of influences, I'd say Winogrand would be a bigger one than, say, Ouija. But I love Ouija. What's not to like about him? Or Metanides from Mexico, who is a very Ouija-like photographer.
What is your opinion and experience about magazines? I think you hinted that somehow the market for photojournalism in magazines is diminishing.
It is, yes. I think this is no great news. Everyone acknowledges and accepts that. I mean, there are times, and I still do probably 12 assignments a year for magazines, and occasionally you get a great spread, you know, but it's not isn't an integral part of my output as it was a decade ago or 20 years ago. So it's sad that we don't see as good spreads these days in magazines, but you know, there's many other avenues which have taken over. And I mean, just the spread of the internet and everything like that, the ability to share pictures on that, you know, doesn't mean it's not the end of the world. Just things change.
If you, how about documentary photography in England generally as compared to 10 years ago? How would you describe
I wouldn't say, I mean, as you're aware, you know, the 80s was a sort of great decade where that new colour documentary became a player, and that was very exciting. I would say now British photography is not as exciting as it was. I mean, we have a few brilliant people like Stephen Gill, for example, who just is amazing how he produces these books and projects. But you know, the energy changes in Europe, and if you think about Europe, you know, obviously like Finland's had its time, you know, it's become an important player, and then somewhere like Holland at the moment, I'd say, if you want to look for real brilliance in photography, I'd say go to Holland, because they have a great understanding how to produce books. They have this incredible graphic sort of legacy, which helps that. And just their sort of wit and wisdom seems to be absolutely the thing at the moment. So in a way that 10 years ago we were all looking at the German schools, you know, now I'd say Holland is the place. It's a hot spot. And then Latin America is emerging as being a very hot sort of place, because we're all tired of China now. We've done China, been there, done it. India's been sort of half done, never as exciting as China only, so the place to be is Latin America. So, you know, all the time, things are changing in photography, and energies switch and change, and that's exciting. No one place can own the top spot for long, because other places are always coming along and inventing new and exciting ideas.
Could you say a few words about your book collection, Martin?
It's very big. It's in 2 buildings, and Scandinavia has its own section. I haven't distinguished between different countries in Scandinavia. And it's extensive. I mean, I take great pleasure in, because I travel so widely, in trying to keep up a good collection of photo books. And luckily people give me books, they all go in, and it's a fantastic resource. And eventually this collection will be either given or sold to the state. I mean, the whole point is that I'm building it on behalf of an institution that doesn't know they're going to get it yet, or I have talked to the Tate. That's the most likely candidate, because they don't have any library at all to speak of, whereas the V&A already have a good library. So the Tate is my chosen partner on this, but you know, it's going to take a long time to negotiate this. And then of course we're going to scan everything, you know, because there are these amazing, the University of Birmingham, I don't know if you're aware of this, have come up with this incredible table for viewing books where it's like 3 meters long, and 12 people can go around. You can just flick over every book. If you see a spread you like, just flick it over there and say, have a look at this. And this is probably going to be shown at Parry Photo next year. It's a new development they're doing, and that's the thing, obviously, that is going to be very valuable. If we get all this lot scanned, or start the scanning program, then we all get to share and look at these amazing books, which are very rare and very expensive and very fragile. So this is obviously the path to go, and this is what will happen.
Do you have any idea how many books you have in?
About 12,000.
So you would appreciate if any one of us would make an own photo book, we would send you a copy.
Why not? Yes, all welcome.
Even if you wouldn't show it to anyone.
Well, no, I mean, I do get a lot of books unsolicited, the quality of which varies enormously, right? So occasionally, when there's a book I really don't think has got, I will give it to the local college and see what they make of it. But generally speaking, I'm very grateful for the books that people send me.
So you mentioned something that you did films as well.
Yes.
Is that something some new?
No, I've been doing films on and off. I mean, I haven't done many. I've done maybe half a dozen.
Documentary?
Yes. If you go to my site, you can just look at clips.
Okay.
Yeah. under the film section. And then there's links if you want to buy them. It's all very sorted out, you know. I was going to show a film today, but we couldn't get it to work. It was my new stick. It wasn't the Media Lab's fault, by the way. I take blame. My new stick that my studio loaded up, there's a glitch on the film part of it. But of course, can we get the internet on here in 2 seconds?
Yes.
I can show you a clip now. Of course we can, Phil, right?
Yeah, everything's possible. What's the address?
Let's go to martinparr.com. What do you want to see? Shall I show you the? I'll show you a clip from Think of England. This is not as good. We're just about to replace this. Let me just have a look. Why do you think this is such a good example of an English bed and breakfast?
Oh, what do you mean by that?
Well, what is it about it that you like?
The friendliness and all that.
Plus the food's excellent.
The food's excellent.
Yeah.
Can't fault the food at all. And the owners are really sociable and everything. You know, and it's lovely.
And the dinners you get is enormous, isn't it?
Yes.
Never only really fit. Once you've had your breakfast, you don't want anything else in the daytime, do you?
No.
But you're having lunch now, and it's.
I know. But
normally it's generally on evening.
Evening meal
yeah,
normally.
yeah.
But on Sundays it's 1 o'clock. Yes.
Traditional Sunday lunch.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jim.
And you're getting 3 courses, are you?
Yes, 3 courses. Really nice dinners and meals, aren't they?
Lovely. Yeah.
Yeah.
Have you ever been abroad?
No. No, haven't. Never been abroad.
So you're not curious just to see what it's like?
No. I heard about some of the foods. Oh.
When they come back from abroad, they're sick and ill, and then they've got to take tablets for this and tablets for that.
Yeah, I've heard people do that.
Yeah. A lot of people in there, ain't there, abroad, ain't there?
Yes. Yes, we have.
You might go abroad when you got lovely weather like this, lovely hotel, lovely sea to look at. Nice blue sea, isn't it?
Oh dear, I'm never
You wouldn't
been
eat all
told
that now, will you?
I went to told that today. God.
You'll have a good go.
Are you
Thank you.
like what? I don't think you have you?
I think they're both the
Are
same.
they?
Well, Jan said they're both the same.
Thank you very much. God.
So you've got the full works there.
Yes, I have.
Beef.
Beef, Yorkshire pudding, roast potatoes, cauliflower, carrots.
Good old English food.
Good old English food that don't upset your stomach.
I'll just show you one last clip. This is just the film I did here in about the sweet factory. This is making the rock that I show you the photo of. What's the most difficult letter to make?
Probably an X. Trained, and then of course they're trained for it, you know.
what the girls like. They are trained, of course, but it's not so hard to train the girls as it is the men.
The lads roll the big rock and they put it out to the size required, and then we just roll it to stop it from going flat.
When you see it, it's very poetic, isn't it? It's like a dance, don't you think?
Okay.
Okay. Thanks, Martin. It's been great to have you here today.
Pleasure.
Welcome back. Thanks very much. Yeah.